Adams said the U.S. is in an unprecedented state of emergency due to the border crisis along the country's southern border, which has resulted in nearly 100,000 immigrants flooding New York City since the spring of 2022. As I stated nearly a year ago, we are facing an unprecedented state of emergency, Adams said. The immigration system in this country is broken, and it has been broken for decades. Today, New York City has been left to pick up the pieces. Adams praised his administration's devotion to finding shelter, food, and resources for the immigrants, but he claimed his city is beyond its breaking point. New York City Council Minority Leader Joe Borelli says over 65,000 illegal immigrants are in New York City. The New York Post has revealed New York City's poorest suburbs have been forced to bear the brunt of the migrant crisis. These are people who came in drips and drabs in the beginning, but now there are over 65,000 in our care in our city, Mr. Borelli told Sky News host James Morrow. A lot of these camps and hotels are located in some of the poorer communities. Migrants are also attributed to a year-over-year increase in the number of citywide ID cards administered that provide access to myriad city programs, services, and discounts. The city issued 138,718 between July 1, 2023 and March of this year, with a New York City Department of Social Services spokesperson telling Newsweek on Monday that the increase in demand is primarily attributable to the influx of asylum seekers to NYC. The influx of migrants coming to the Big Apple has drastically slowed since the beginning of the year, but the number of those in city shelters has remained the same, even with the mayor's time limits on stays. Between 1,100 and 1,500 migrants have been arriving in the city each week since March, according to figures from the Adams administration. It followed peaks of about 4,000 weekly migrant arrivals in January, when the shelter population hit a high of about 69,500. As of last Tuesday, there were about 65,300 migrants housed in the taxpayer funder shelters, a tally that plateaued in March, when the range of weekly arrivals was 1,100 to 1,200, down from 1,300 to 1,500 in February, according to the figures. About 1,100 migrants came to the city in the week ending June 16, the most recent number City Hall would provide. The best way to lower the migrant population is to stop the freebies, get rid of the right to shelter, and end sanctuary city status, the Democrat said. He added the population isn't declining despite far fewer arrivals, proving once again that the detached idealism by the left when the limits were placed was unfounded. On Monday, just a few dozen people stood outside the Migrant Arrival Center at Midtown's Roosevelt Hotel, a stark contrast from earlier this year when the line wrapped around the block. Local workers said that the full-size charter buses which used to bring migrants to the city have been replaced by smaller vehicles that drop off the new arrivals at the Welcome Center a few times a week. City Hall, when pressed by the Post, said it expects to see the shelter population dip before the school year starts up in the fall. New York's compassion may be limitless, but our resources are not, and our partners at the state and federal level know this, Adams said. We continue to face impossible decisions about allocating our resources. That means a lose-lose for our most vulnerable New Yorkers, as well as those seeking asylum. He added that a state of emergency declaration from the Biden administration would allow federal funds to be allocated to the city faster in order to help with urgent challenges the city is facing. Adams also called for resources on the state level from Gov. Kathy Hochul, such as state-run humanitarian centers and relief sites. New York City Mayor Eric Adams said Wednesday the ongoing immigration crisis could cost the city $12 billion over 3 years if things don't change, reiterating the call for more federal aid. Over the last year, nearly 100,000 asylum seekers have arrived in our city looking for a new life, Mr. Adams, a Democrat, said in a statement. New York City has managed the problem largely by ourselves. This is a national crisis that's begged for a national response since day one, he continued. Despite our tireless effort, we're running out of resources. There are more than 57,300 illegal immigrants currently in the city's care. The average cost of each household is $383 per night for shelter, food, medical care, and social services. That amounts to $9.8 million per day and $300 million per day. But this is the floor, not the ceiling. This is only an estimate if the number of migrants in our care stays the same over time, the mayor told reporters at Wednesday's press conference. The mayor said they are finding every way to reduce costs. It could be something simple as the meal. If we could save, $1 or $2 on the meals. If we could save on the laundries, because, all those sheets have to be cleaned. If we could save on napkins, he said. We're looking everywhere to see how we can bring down the costs of the asylum seekers. However, without policy changes, New York City will continue to brace for newcomers, Mr. Edmas said, warning its residents could face a $4.7 billion bill for immigrants this fiscal year. Over the next 3 fiscal years, the costs are expected to reach $12 billion. Our compassion may be limitless, but our resources are not, he said. This is the budgetary reality we are facing if we don't get the additional support we need. New Yorkers did not create an international humanitarian crisis, but our city's residents have been left to deal with this crisis almost entirely on our own, he said. New York City's shelter system has already been overwhelmed. City officials have worked to house illegal immigrants in churches and private homes and asked the courts to relieve them, providing shelter to all who seek it. With the number continuing to grow by hundreds daily, city leaders announced earlier this week that they're opening a new shelter on Randall's Island that could house up to 2,000 people. Continuing to house tens of thousands of migrants in city shelters with no end in sight is not sustainable, an official in Mayor Eric Adams' administration said Tuesday. The 64,000 cannot be our baseline, Deputy Mayor Ann Williams Isom told a reporter during a City Hall briefing. That's not where we want to be. Just last week, some 900 migrants got to the city, the first time that figure was below 1,000 since October 2022, the administration said. The Adams administration has held up its controversial time limits on shelter stays as a main driver in reducing the burden on the city's overwhelmed shelter system. During the mayor's weekly off-topic press conference, conceded that the 60-day limits haven't proven to be as effective for families, who make up the majority of migrants being housed in city shelters. There's no magic bullet here, but in a lot of places where people have a large majority of families with children, the way that they were able to get them out of shelter wasn't necessarily through time limits, but it was through resettling people and working with other jurisdictions to make sure that people get settled, she said, citing findings from an international conference on the issue she attended in Paris recently. That's what we're going to have to focus on, Williams Isom continued. 64,000 cannot be our baseline. That is not sustainable. We have to figure out what tools and continue to be innovative in order to move people out of shelter. Adams' Chief of Staff Camille Joseph Varlack added, I would add to that, where we have seen resettlement, of course, be extremely successful is where folks have the work authorization, so we will continue to advocate for that as well. Administration officials said last month that only about 2,000 migrants have been connected with a job as part of an ongoing push to help find work for asylum seekers. New York City shelters are housing over 65,000 migrants on the taxpayer dime. That city will be bankrupt in no time. As New York City prepares another round of prepaid debit cards for the illegal immigrants in its taxpayer-funded care, its leaders admit the crisis has no end in sight. The city is currently sheltering over 65,000 illegals in city shelters, and even Mayor Adams' office knows it's not sustainable. Yet they offer zero solutions. Well, beyond resettling the illegals in other jurisdictions for them to deal with, passing the buck and the burden, even the 60-day shelter limit hasn't worked due to the large numbers of families staying in those shelters who have nowhere else to go. Perhaps being a sanctuary city that offers perks and privileges like debit cards and housing to those who enter our country illegally isn't the best way to run one of America's greatest cities.